So we go to the last speaker, Professor Seamus Simpson from the University here of Salford, about public policy and media convergence, paths, limitations and prospects. The presentation will give you an overview of media convergence from the perspective of how telecom, broadcasting, IT and publishing have to come closer together. This mainly facilitated through the internet. But this is actually not yet the case for the regulatory and public policy perspective. Seamus is Professor of Media Policy in the School of Arts and Media at University of Salford. His research interests lie in European and global communications media policy. Specific focus has been on a range of internet, telecommunications and digital media convergence governance issues. Seamus' research has been funded by the ESRC and the European Commission. He's part of the consulting team which undertook the first EU-funded evaluation of the Pan-European Electronic Communication Regulator, BEREC, in 2012. In 2014, he became division chair of the Communication Law and Policy Division of the International Communication Association, ICA, and he is also a member of the board of directors of that association. Seamus co-organized a lot of international conferences abroad and also here in Media City in Manchester. Okay, Seamus, please.
Okay, thank you very much, Jose, for that very kind introduction. And I have to say before I start that this is the shortest distance that I've travelled to give a talk at an international media conference, as my desk is on the 3rd floor of this building. So I'm most definitely not suffering from jet lag. So there are probably other reasons for any deficiencies that you find in what I've got to say. Okay, so I'm conscious of the time and I'm conscious that lunch awaits, so I'll try and keep this fairly brief. Okay, so the talk today is based on a book that came out last Friday, handily enough, and it's a book written with my long-standing collaborator, formerly of the University of Manchester, Professor Peter Humphreys. And as you can see, we focus in this book on regulation, governance and convergence in the media. And our key contention is that, as we all know in this room, media convergence has had a relatively long history and is multifaceted. Its processes and its governance in particular, which is our concern, present many challenging and as yet unanswered policy questions, as Ed and Peggy in particular have illuminated for us very clearly today. For the biggest problem for us is often the under-acknowledged in confident assertions about convergence that you read in various quarters. It's problematic and only partially complete, contested and even precarious nature. And if you don't acknowledge that readily enough and extensively enough, for us you see political, social, cultural and as well economic challenges from the context of convergence that we're witnessing. So it's really important to understand that the coming together of different forms and elements of media which characterize what we understand as convergence into a common space doesn't automatically lead to their integration. Okay, so what's a definition of media convergence? Well, there are many. We've gone for the most general, probably one of the more unsatisfactory, but here it is for you. It's the coming together in various ways of the technologies, platforms, services and markets of broadcasting, IT, the internet, telecom and publishing. Media governance and media policy is our particular concern, and we draw on the work of Des Friedman for a definition of media governance. And Des tells us that it is the sum total of mechanisms, formal and informal, national and supranational, centralized and dispersed, that aim to organize media systems according to the resolution of media policy debates. And those media policy debates are sites of contested and continual development of goals and norms that lead to the creation of instruments that are designed to shape the structure and behaviour of media systems. So that's my business. That's what I study on a daily basis almost. It's a complex phenomenon in itself, and it's a challenge. But our contention in this book, and my contention in this talk today, is that whilst we've seen a lot of focus on developing technologies and expanding markets and turbocharging commercialism, we have by contrast seen not enough evidence of strong, concerted, detailed public policy to deal with some of the very significant negative consequences that occur and are occurring from media convergence, notwithstanding the many, many wonderful and positive things that it has and is and will provide for us, thanks to the very impressive work of people working in industrial and commercial circles nationally and worldwide, and many of whom are here today. Okay, so a focus on media convergence and governance, nevertheless, allows an explanation to be provided for the problematic and incomplete nature of media convergence. And if you understand institutional landscapes, we argue, and communication policy processes in which media convergence issues are considered or not considered, or often incompletely considered and resolved, that will be essential to understanding how and why media convergence has developed in the way that it has to date, and also to think about its future prospects. So for us as political scientists, or media policy scholars more particularly, our focus has been on what we call the neoliberal paradigm, the neoliberal policy agendas and governance frameworks that have developed and been deployed in the communications sector, and much more broadly, of course, societally, over recent decades. And they've gone hand in hand with the characteristic features of media convergence that we've seen, not least some of the problematic elements of it. Okay, so what is neoliberalism and media convergence in essence? Well, the need to stimulate developments in media technologies and the new goods and services stemming from them are considered of paramount importance, and indeed rightly so. The argument is that this should be achieved through market-based changes to create competition in new markets, alongside developments in governance arrangements to secure reformed market structures that promote competition. And there's much evidence that that has worked and worked well. However, there's considerable evidence that it is insufficient in its own right to deal with the problems of media convergence, and also to grasp fully, in our view, the many opportunities that media convergence is affording and will afford into the future. So, media convergence and neoliberalism share, for us, the common feature often as having been propounded as inevitable, inexorable, irresistible. And none of those three things are indeed the case for us. The view that technological change creates new enhanced services in an environment of unparalleled consumer choice is a wonderful one, and it's led to arguments that governance structures and media policy arrangements need to change to accommodate and to bring to fruition the benefits of media convergence thus articulated. But as I've indicated to you, for us, that's not the complete story by any means. Okay, so this is the part of the presentation that should be subtitled Teaching Your Grandmother How to Suck Eggs, but I want to get through it fairly quickly. Everyone here will know the main technological changes in information and communications technologies that have taken us in the direction of convergence. Some of these emerged in telecommunications and information technology, and specifically digitalization, or the application of computer-based communications technologies to other parts of communication. In the first instance, telecom meant techno-functionally that you could have combinations of voice, data, text and pictures delivered across standard telecom infrastructure. the extra transmission capacity that would be required for that would be delivered through fibre optic technology, heralded way back in the 1970s as a context for high-speed, content-laden and interactive network-based communication. Yet again, the use of the airwaves for personal communication became a reality in the embryonic mobile comms sector. Digitization of the airwaves soon followed as a convergence-based partial solution to capacity problems of microwave communication. And now for most of us, we have access to mobile broadband, internet on the move, etc., etc. In broadcasting too, consideration of the broadening of telecom into the enhanced services realm opened up the possibility of widening the transmission of audiovisual content through copper and then fibre optic cable. The fairly well-established technologies of international satellite communication were developed and applied to provide domestic television services and resulted in unprecedented increase in network capacity. The digitization of broadcast communication networks gathered pace through the 90s. Turbocharging the general trend towards network capacity expansion. Digitization of broadcasting affected cable, satellite and terrestrial networks alike. Now we all know this, of course, but it set the context for the media convergence that we witness today, and separately, alongside that, of course, and extremely importantly, the internet emerged from the shadows of network-based communication, but by the mid-90s it was illustrating its power to become the most significant development in mass communication since TV for us. And although it was developed through the creation of bespoke communication architecture to some extent, for it to realize its full significance, internet traffic needed to utilize longer established telecom infrastructure, as we all know. An internet communication protocol, therefore assisted by a raft of technical innovations enabling user-friendly point-and-click environments, provided both the oil and the glue of media convergence. So developments within ICT and to some extent the original separate emergence of the internet and then its coming together and utilization of developing ICT networks have created this context. So as we know, those with operational control of network transmission provided common carriage services for the growing, increasingly content-rich and diverse volume of traffic that the internet was giving rise to. Common carriage is one of the most established principles in telecom. And we know that the online environment became characterized by the potential to collapse in a way never before witnessed, the distinction between telecom, radio, TV, journalism and book publishing. One of the most significant developments in the last 10 years, as Peggy and others have told us, is the rise of social networking platforms on the internet. And the emergence of these so-called social media has only a fleeting resonance for us with early ideas of communitarian-based communication. Whilst they are venues within an enormous amount of information is exchanged between human beings, the environment is heavily underpinned by commerciality, as we know. The emergence of the internet therefore created a global communication logic and increased user friendliness, which fueled expectations of a new, richer, faster and more interactive 24-hour communications environment. The global internet is seen as the epitome of media convergence, and it has brought many, many wonderful things, but it has also brought a lot of challenges. Therefore, there is contestation in any consideration of media convergence from our perspective. And there's contestation over convergence as an inevitable process shaped by technological innovations and commercial development. And the idea that convergence drives cultural, economic and social development automatically is something that policy researchers and policymakers need to challenge. We argue that neoliberal governance changes of the kind that I highlighted very briefly to you in traditional aspects of ICT in response to technological change, combined with the emergence of the internet with initial libertarian origins but thereafter fundamental market liberal values and a modus operandi, are the underpinnings of the analysis of media convergence governance. So, as an academic, my job and Peter Humphrey's job and others is to contextualize, and as a consequence occasionally to deflate the hyperbole that often surrounds convergence. And we try to translate that into clear messages which might be listened to, if not adopted, by national and international policy-making communities. So how do we do this? How do we develop a public policy for media convergence? Well, the media sector for us is rhetorically underpinned by visions of individual fulfillment and development delivered through growing consumerism and fast-paced market and service-based change. And indeed, that may well be the case for many people. In such a predominant cultural landscape, the provision of media infrastructures and services, therefore through public action, historically very strong in constituent parts of what we now understand as a convergent media environment, may seem outmoded, arcane, redundant. We would argue that's not the case. But for us, convergence is a process, and it's still very much in development, and as such, it presents considerable opportunities from a public policy perspective. So we're not presenting a dystopian analysis by any means. Therefore, for us, media governance and policy can set the context for more inclusive and progressive processes of convergence to unfold. And these policies should be underpinned by a recognition of the interconnected and overlapping nature of media convergence, and that we should understand that public provision, protection and promotion of digital convergence infrastructure and content is a relevant and reasonable media policy goal to hold nationally and internationally, alongside all the great commercial developments. So, in the book, we set this out and then we look at different areas of the communications landscape and suggest policy directions or policy solutions. So I'm going to talk about a few of those in the next 5 minutes. In respect of infrastructure, we suggest the adoption of flexible policy approaches combining private sector-led investment with a stronger public sector vision and interventionism than has hitherto been the case. We advocate policies for network upgrade that must go beyond the facilitation of market-based solutions where state aid is tolerated somewhat apologetically as a second-best suboptimal safety net. Neither should public sector aid for us be viewed as a first-stage pre-commercial temporary policy solution read in the context of a neoliberal lens exclusively. Secondly, in the key area of mobility and spectrum use, we argue that we need to keep the public interest uses of spectrum at the forefront of media policy agendas. The speed and extent of migration of broadcasting to IP networks over the next decade or more will be critical. The performance of the mobile communications sector in using the allocated spectrum should be, and indeed is, an ongoing regulatory concern. Undertaking a comparative analysis of the public value generated historically by terrestrial broadcast players in their occupation of the spectrum and the way they're doing this contemporaneously is also important. And any changes to the allocation of spectrum away from broadcasters, both commercial and publicly funded, who hold a public service mission, shouldn't stymie the development of progressive policies for media content. Finally, a reconsideration of wirelessly provided services, commercially and otherwise, as delivering at least in part a public service function into the future in terms of enriching digital citizenship is something that we would advocate. Another big area we focus on is the thorny issue of net neutrality, which for us bridges infrastructure and media content issues. And I've argued this elsewhere beyond the book, but we argue that developing existing understandings of net neutrality needs to take place, possibly radically. Drawing upon and taking forward the idea of intervention exposes the myth of neutrality and the paucity of a laissez-faire strategy in communication. We've had intervention to slow and speed up and manage traffic. The idea of intervention is part and parcel of the communications sector historically. It's nothing new. It's a question of how we deal with it. So selective intervention as a media policy tool to create a new and enlightened understanding of the idea of neutrality as an environment of equal communications opportunity and rights is something that could be developed in our understanding of net neutrality. We need to challenge the idea of neutrality as a passive concept in policy terms and assert the need to intervene proactively in online communication environments to deliver enriched public utility, which capitalizes on the collapsing distinction between one-to-one and one-to-many communication interactions. And we argue that we should incorporate and rework media policy ideas, in particular from the realm of broadcasting, to focus on the attainment of equality of access and participation rather than non-interference. Okay, I'm conscious of the time now, and to finish I want to just move through to focus on the last area of recommendation. I have in this presentation also got some slides on media power and media concentration, which is one of the chapters in the book, but I want to focus instead on public service media in line with what I've just said. So we argue that to counterbalance private commercial accumulations of media power, that by dint of the international nature of the online world, escape easy regulation, and Ed has shown us examples of this, as indeed has Peggy. We argue it will be necessary to maintain strong, well-resourced public service media providers which have an extensive content remit and which are given the means to develop into public service media for the internet era. We argue that, for example, a well-run public service broadcaster with internally pluralistic services could serve as a vital counterbalance to the commercial sector where there is evidence of sufficient external pluralism commercially. Of insufficient external pluralism commercially due to high media concentration in key areas. We also argue for public support for media pluralism. Subsidies should be considered for crisis-ridden newspapers, for launching new online ventures, for independent production, for regional production, for community radio and television. All of this done in a technologically neutral approach could also be taken forward and subsidized into public service journalism. Specifically, we argue that it's possible to consider raising an industry levy on the profits of those commercial companies which enjoy significant market power in advertising and pay TV markets. We could provide public support to the media through public-private partnerships to help new internet startups and provide a means to help alleviate the crisis of the press to allow it to establish itself in the digital era. And so long as it's not funded by top-slicing existing public service broadcasting funds, we argue for the creation of a new public service publisher type institution to disperse funds on a transparent and contestable basis. In the age of digital convergence, public service communication should not be conceived as something only related to broadcasting, something of the past, in other words. It needs to be conceived of as relevant to the internet era. Okay, so in conclusion, therefore, it's our argument that the risk of reduced policy effectiveness in the digital media environment should be acknowledged because of its complexity. It's a feature that comes with the territory of media convergence. We shouldn't be afraid to fail, to borrow an idea from the communications industries. But this can be leveraged through developing international policy exchange fora for media convergence to understand the problems of convergence and the different perspectives taken on it. The reduced ability of the media policy tool of regulation and regulatory governance because of the internationality of much of the communications industries, the reduced ability of that to be effective on its own points to the potential utility of combinative policy action. Given the complex, multi-layered nature of media convergence, we need to design media policy package-based solutions that combine technical, legal, regulatory, fiscal, and educative tools. Of course, this is complex, messy, and potentially ineffective. It requires innovation and flexibility in thinking and implementation. But if we take it on and are prepared to fail whilst leading forward into an environment where we're eventually successful, I think for us this is one of the ways that we will most fruitfully reassert public policy in an environment of media convergence. Thank you very much.